The final offensive was named the Ho Chi Minh Campaign. For the assault, the NVA deployed 250,000 men and hundreds of tanks. The troops were superbly equipped and supported by massed artillery. And as they advanced south, they made use of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of equipment abandoned by the South Vietnamese. Behind them was a vast and sophisticated supply system. North Vietnamese transport aircraft and ships were now ferrying men and materials into captured airfields and ports in South Vietnam. The first attacks of the Ho Chi Minh Campaign opened on April 9, 1975. The only effective resistance to the advance took place at Xuan Loc, where for almost 2 weeks, Southern forces made a desperate and die-hard stand. The North Vietnamese threw more than 30,000 men at Xuan Loc, backed by powerful tank and artillery forces. Against all the odds, the 6,000 men of the South Vietnamese 18th Division refused to crack. In 2 weeks of bitter fighting, the North Vietnamese hit the defenders of Xuan Loc with 20,000 shells and rockets. Still, Southern forces drove back mass infantry attacks. They killed over 5,000 NVA troops and destroyed dozens of tanks. It was to prove the last big battle of the Vietnam War. In the end, the defenders were forced to pull back. 1 in 3 of the South Vietnamese 18th Division were dead. The fall of Xuan Loc meant the road to Ben Ha and Saigon itself was wide open. With the direct threat to the capital, on April 21st, President Thieu resigned and fled to Taiwan. Members of the Provisional Revolutionary Government in Paris had earlier indicated they'd be prepared to negotiate with General Duong Van Minh, a trusted intermediary. However, for the moment, the Southern government was paralyzed. A mass exodus of foreigners, government officials, and the remaining Americans was already underway. Saigon docks were crammed with boats as thousands tried to escape by sea. On April 25, 1975, they launched their final assault. One by one, the defending South Vietnamese divisions were cut off and overwhelmed. On April 28th, as NVA forces pressed in on the city, General Minh was sworn in as president. Attacks on Tan Son Nhut Airport closed its runways. Only helicopters now offered a way out. Starting on April 29, 1975, U.S. Marine and Air Force helicopters flying from carriers offshore began a massive airlift. In 18 hours, over 1,000 American civilians and almost 7,000 South Vietnamese refugees were flown out of Saigon. The helicopters were leaving from Tan Son Nhut Airport, now besieged by refugees desperate to escape. The scenes of panic and chaos were repeated at the U.S. Embassy, where helicopters were landing and taking off from inside the grounds. U.S. Marines flown in to protect the evacuation struggled to control the thousands of terrified civilians fighting for a place. At 4:03 a.m. on April 30th, 2 U.S. Marines were caught in a Viet Cong rocket attack on the airport. They were the last Americans to die in the Vietnam War. A constant stream of American helicopters shuttled between embattled Saigon and the rescue fleet off the coast. At the same time, South Vietnamese military pilots were using their own or commandeered aircraft to escape. The decks of some American ships became so crowded that helicopters had to be pushed overboard. The last Marines of the U.S. force guarding the evacuation of the embassy left Saigon at dawn on April 30th, 1975. As their helicopter took off from the embassy roof, looters were already ransacking the lower stories of the building. "5 hours after the last Americans had gone, North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the streets of the South Vietnamese capital. The government had ordered the army to lay down its weapons, and there was almost no resistance. Shortly before noon, T-54 tanks of the NVA 2nd Corps rolled through the gates of the presidential palace. For the United States, the Vietnam War left a painful legacy of bitterness and division. As the nation tried to forget a humiliating and frustrating episode in its history, those who had served were ignored or greeted with outright hostility. It was 1982 before veterans of the conflict were finally recognized with the building of the Vietnam Memorial. For America, only then could the ghost of Vietnam finally begin to be laid to rest.